Ravenwood Manor, the Black Raven Estate. The wind howled through the rugged Scottish Highlands as the storm rolled over the darkened sky, swallowing the last hints of twilight. The road leading to Ravenwood Manor, or as the locals called it, the Black Raven Estate, was barely more than a dirt path, winding through the mist-laden moors. The few villagers who still lived nearby spoke of it in hushed whispers, as if the mere mention of its name could summon something unspeakable. It was on this very road that Jonathan Mercer, an American historian, found himself, gripping the wheel of his rental car tightly as he navigated through the dense fog. The flickering headlights barely illuminated the twisted branches of the gnarled trees lining the path, their skeletal forms reaching out like claws eager to grasp at him. He wasn't superstitious. Not yet. Jonathan had spent his career debunking myths, unraveling the truth behind ghost stories and cursed places. His latest project had brought him here, to Ravenwood Manor, a place abandoned for over a century, yet still whispered about as if it had a life of its own. The history intrigued him. The manor was once home to the Elliot family, an aristocratic lineage that had thrived during the 18th century, until their sudden and complete disappearance in 1832. Not a single trace of them was ever found. No bodies, no letters, just an untouched feast on the dining table, as if they had all risen from their seats and walked into the night, never to return. The only clue to their fate was a single, ominous phrase carved into the dining hall wall. "The Black Wings shall take what is owed." Jonathan had read every article, every old record he could find on the estate. He knew that several attempts had been made to restore or sell the property, but all had failed. Strange accidents plagued the workers. Some refused to step foot inside. Others disappeared. And now, Jonathan was here, alone. The wrought iron gates of Ravenwood Manor stood before him, rusted but still imposing. He hesitated for a moment, taking in the grotesque raven carvings perched atop the entrance, their beady stone eyes seeming to watch him. A shiver crawled up his spine, but he dismissed it as the cold. He pushed the gate, and to his surprise, it swung open with a low, creaking groan, as if it had been waiting for him. The manor loomed ahead, its towering structure barely visible in the thick fog. A Victorian monstrosity, with spires that clawed at the sky, windows like hollow eyes, and a front door that stood slightly ajar. Jonathan grabbed his flashlight and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of decay and aged wood. The grand hallway stretched before him, dust dancing in the dim light. The wallpaper had long since peeled away, revealing rotting wood underneath. Chandeliers hung precariously from the ceiling, their crystals dulled by years of neglect. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the house itself was mocking him with delayed whispers. He set his bag down, pulling out his notebook and recorder. Day 1. Entry into Ravenwood Manor. The structure is in worse shape than expected, but remains largely intact. The air is unnaturally cold despite the fireplace in the Great Hall appearing to have been used recently. No signs of forced entry. No signs of life. Click. He turned off the recorder and exhaled. Then he saw it. A single black feather lying in the middle of the hallway. It was too large for any ordinary bird, almost the size of a human hand. He crouched down, touching it. It was warm, A thud sounded from upstairs. His head snapped up, heart pounding. Jonathan straightened, shining his flashlight toward the grand staircase. The steps were dust-covered, except for a single fresh footprint leading upward. He was not alone. The forgotten room. Summoning his courage, Jonathan climbed the stairs, each step groaning beneath his weight. The upper floor was worse than the first, walls warped with age. Paintings barely clinging to their frames. Most of the doors were shut, except for one at the very end of the corridor. It was open, and inside, the candle was still burning. He stepped forward, pushing the door wider. It was a bedroom, surprisingly untouched by time. The canopy bed was neatly made, the furniture polished, and atop the writing desk, an ornate silver mirror stood. Jonathan stepped closer, his reflection distorted in the old glass. Then, behind him, he saw it, a figure in black standing just outside the doorway. He spun around. Nothing. The candle flickered violently, and suddenly, the room grew colder. The mirror behind him began to fog, as if something unseen was breathing against it. And then, as he watched in horror, words etched themselves onto the glass. "Leave before the wings take you." Jonathan stumbled back, heart hammering against his ribs. The house was no longer abandoned. Something, or someone, was here, and it did not want him to stay. Jonathan's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he staggered backward from the mirror, his pulse thundering in his ears. The room felt suffocating now, the air thick with something unseen, something ancient. The message on the mirror had begun to fade, but its warning was seared into his mind. "Leave before the wings take you." He turned, scanning the doorway where he had seen the dark figure. His flashlight quivered in his grasp as he stepped out into the corridor. Silence swallowed the house once more, but he knew now that he was not alone. A floorboard creaked behind him. Jonathan spun around, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The doorway to the bedroom was still open, revealing nothing but the flickering candle inside. He took a slow, deliberate step back, his instincts screaming at him to run. But he wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Something brushed past him, cold and swift, like a shadow given form. His breath hitched, and he turned sharply, but there was nothing there. The hallway stretched before him, an empty, gaping throat of darkness leading deeper into the manor. He swallowed hard, his grip tightening around his flashlight and recorder. He had come here to uncover the truth, and he wasn't about to be scared off by tricks of the mind. But then the whispering started. It was faint at first, a barely perceptible rustling, like dry leaves scraping against the ground. Then, it grew, words forming in a language Jonathan did not recognize. Guttural and low, the sound sent a chill through his spine, a primal fear awakening in him. A gust of wind rushed through the corridor. Though all the windows remained closed, the whispering grew louder, the voices overlapping, pressing into his mind like a tide of shadows. Jonathan turned on his heel and hurried down the hallway, his footsteps pounding against the warped wooden floor. He needed to get out, needed to breathe air that wasn't tainted with unseen horrors. But as he reached the top of the grand staircase, he froze. The entrance doors below were wide open, and standing just beyond the threshold, silhouetted against the storm outside, was a figure. It was draped in black, its form indistinct, but its head, a raven's head, sleek and glossy, its beady black eyes fixed directly on him. Jonathan's stomach twisted. His mind screamed at him to move, to flee, but his legs remained locked in place. The figure took a slow step forward, and as it did, the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, coiling around its form. Then, the whispering voices spoke as one. "The black wings shall take what is owed." A force struck Jonathan square in the chest, knocking him off his feet. He tumbled backward, his flashlight skittering across the floor as darkness consumed his vision. He woke to silence. Jonathan groaned, his head throbbing as he pushed himself up from the cold floor. His surroundings had changed. He was no longer at the top of the stairs. He was in a grand dining hall. The long wooden table stretched before him, draped in a decayed but once lavish tablecloth. Silverware and plates sat undisturbed, as if awaiting guests who had long since vanished. The air smelled of dust and something faintly metallic. Jonathan's heart seized. At the head of the table sat a single plate, and on it, a black feather. He staggered back, his breath quickening. The whispering voices had gone, replaced by an eerie stillness that made his skin crawl. He turned to leave, but as he did, a figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the hall. Not one, three. They stood motionless, their bodies wrapped in tattered 18th century garments, their faces obscured by darkness. But Jonathan could feel their gaze on him. One of them lifted an arm and pointed directly at him. The doors behind him slammed shut. Then, in unison, the figures stepped forward. Jonathan did not wait to see what would happen next. He spun, lunging toward the nearest window. But as he reached it, the glass darkened, warping into an unnatural reflection, his own face, twisted in terror, staring back at him. The reflection opened its mouth. A raven's cry split the air. Jonathan stumbled back, gasping. The figures in the dining hall were closer now, their movements deliberate, purposeful. He fumbled for his recorder, but his fingers were numb, his body ice cold with fear. The whispering returned, swirling around him, pressing against his mind. His vision blurred, his breath came in ragged bursts. Then, darkness. Dash dash dash. Jonathan awoke in his car. The engine was still running, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The manor loomed before him, untouched by time, as if he had never set foot inside. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? His heartbeat thundered in his ears. His mind raced with what he had seen, what he had heard. He reached for his recorder, praying he had captured something, anything. His fingers trembled as he pressed play. Static filled the air. Then, a single phrase whispered through the speakers. "The black wings shall take what is owed." Jonathan's blood ran cold. The recorder clicked off on its own. And in his passenger seat, lying atop his open notebook, was a single black feather. Bleeding House. The town of Blackridge was the kind of place that didn't like to talk about its ghosts. Nestled in the quiet countryside of Pennsylvania, it was a picturesque town on the surface, Victorian homes with well-kept gardens. A main street lined with antique shops. and a strong sense of community. But beneath that quaint charm lay a deep, unspoken fear, centered around one house. The official address was 12 Willow Lane, but no one called it that anymore. To the townsfolk, it had been Bleeding House for nearly a century. It was a name spoken in hushed whispers, a name that made children shiver and parents avert their eyes. Despite numerous attempts to renovate, repurpose, or demolish it, the house remained, looming, waiting. The first documented incident occurred in 1923, when the Langford family moved in. Henry and Margaret Langford, along with their 2 children, were a well-respected family, known for their generosity. But one autumn night, neighbors heard screams coming from the house. By the time the authorities arrived, the entire Langford family was found dead, their bodies mutilated in ways that defied explanation. Blood seeped through the walls, pooling onto the hardwood floors. The police report described the crime scene as unnaturally drenched in red. The town tried to forget. The house was scrubbed clean, the blood-covered walls repainted. But then the second family moved in, and the bleeding started again. By the 1950s, Bleeding House had developed a reputation. Tenants came and went, some lasting only a few days before fleeing. Every report was the same, blood oozing from the walls, appearing only on nights of the full moon. The phenomenon was studied, analyzed, dismissed as urban legend. Yet, the house remained uninhabited, abandoned to time and decay. Daniel Whitmore was a journalist with a taste for the supernatural. He had spent years investigating haunted locations across the country, debunking myths and uncovering hidden truths. When he heard about Bleeding House, he knew he had to see it for himself. Arriving in Blackridge, Daniel was met with the expected resistance. The locals refused to discuss the house, their expressions darkening at its mention. He visited the town archives, poring over old newspapers, police reports, and first-hand accounts. The stories were consistent: blood appearing from the walls, tenants suffering from nightmares, an overwhelming sense of dread consuming all who entered. It was exactly what he was looking for. He rented the house for a month. The real estate agent, an elderly woman named Mrs. Garrett, had practically begged him to reconsider. "No one stays," she said, clutching his arm. "You'll leave before the first week is up." "They all do." Daniel only smiled. "We'll see." The house was eerily silent when he stepped inside. Dust coated every surface. Cobwebs stretched across corners. But it was intact. The air was thick, musty, carrying the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic. He set up his recording equipment, cameras, and notebooks. If something was going to happen, he wanted proof. The first night passed uneventfully. He explored each room, documenting the faded floral wallpaper, the rusted chandeliers, the grand but decaying staircase. He found nothing, no ghosts, no blood, just a forgotten house waiting to be remembered. Then the full moon rosé. It started in the dining room. A soft drip, like water hitting the floor. Daniel turned, his breath catching as he saw it. A thin, red line trickled down the wallpaper. He moved closer, reaching out. The liquid was thick, warm. He brought his fingers to his nose, coppery, unmistakable. Blood. More of it emerged, seeping from the walls, oozing from the ceiling, Pooling at his feet, the house groaned, the sound of shifting wood and something deeper, something alive. The air turned heavy, pressing down on his chest. Then came the whispers, faint at first, indistinguishable murmurs. But as the blood continued to flow, the voices grew louder. They filled the room, overlapping, speaking in a language he didn't understand. Daniel staggered back, his mind racing between fear and exhilaration. This was it. This was real. But then, amidst the chaos, a single voice broke through. "Leave." It was a woman's voice. Urgent, desperate. Daniel turned sharply, scanning the room. He was alone. Yet, the voice had been so clear, so close. Then the whispers stopped. The blood slowed, the house returning to an eerie silence. Daniel exhaled, his pulse pounding. He had come for answers. And he was going to get them, no matter what it took. Daniel barely slept that night. He spent hours reviewing his recordings, replaying the moment when the blood seeped through the walls and the voice, clear, unmistakable, warned him to leave. Every instinct told him to listen, to abandon this cursed house before it was too late. But his journalist's mind, his insatiable hunger for truth, refused to let him walk away. Morning brought no comfort. The walls were clean again, as if nothing had happened. The blood had vanished without a trace. He searched every room, every floorboard, but found nothing. The only evidence that the events of the previous night had been real was the recording on his device. "Leave." The voice sent a chill through him every time he played it back. Determined, Daniel decided to dig deeper. The town archives had provided historical accounts, but now he needed something more personal. He sought out the town's oldest residents, hoping someone might be willing to talk. It took hours of persuasion, but finally, an old man named Edgar Sullivan agreed to meet him at a diner on the outskirts of town. Edgar had lived in Blackridge his entire life. His eyes were clouded with age, but there was still a sharpness behind them, a weight that came with knowing things best left unsaid. "You're wasting your time," Edgar said, stirring his coffee. "That house has been bleeding for 100 years. It's not a story you want to tell." Daniel leaned forward. "But why? Who started it? What happened?" Edgar sighed heavily, rubbing a gnarled hand over his face. The Langford family was the first to die there. But they weren't the first to suffer. That house, it's older than it should be. No one knows who built it, and no one should ever have lived in it. Daniel frowned. "But there are records." Edgar shook his head. "Records can be altered. Stories change. But the land remembers." A shiver ran down Daniel's spine. "So what does it remember?" The old man hesitated, his fingers tightening around his cup. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "A debt unpaid. A price still owed." Daniel opened his mouth to press for more, but Edgar stood abruptly, leaving a crumpled bill on the table. "You should go home, son, before it's too late." That night, Daniel returned to Bleeding House with renewed determination. If the land remembered, he needed to dig deeper, literally. Armed with a shovel, he ventured into the backyard, where the ground was uneven and overgrown. He began to dig near the withered oak tree at the property's edge. Driven by some unshakable instinct, the earth gave way too easily. Barely a foot down, his shovel struck something hard. His breath caught as he cleared away the dirt. revealing something wrapped in rotting cloth. He reached down, fingers trembling, and peeled the fabric away. A skull stared back at him. He recoiled, heart hammering, but he forced himself to look closer. The skeletal remains were old, yet eerily well preserved, and then, as if responding to his discovery, the house groaned. The air turned heavy. The whispers returned. Daniel staggered back, dropping the shovel. The blood seeped from the ground this time, thick and dark, staining his hands. The whispers became words, a chorus of voices echoing from the depths of the house. Leave, leave, leave. Then, a new voice, deeper, angrier. You should not have disturbed the grave. Daniel spun toward the house, breath hitching in his throat. The figure stood at the window, a woman in tattered 19th century clothing, her face pale, her eyes sunken, blood dripped from her fingers. And as Daniel watched in horror, her mouth opened, and the house screamed. Windows shattered, the door slammed open, the blood poured faster, rushing from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The ground beneath him trembled as the house exhaled a gust of cold air, knocking him backward. His vision blurred, his lungs burned, and then, darkness. Daniel woke up in his car. The sun had risen, the town of Blackridge stirring to life. But something was wrong. His hands were clean, his clothes were clean, his camera was missing. His notebook, gone. His phone, dead. Had it all been a dream? But then he saw it. In the passenger seat, resting atop a folded newspaper, was a single black feather soaked in blood. The headline on the newspaper read, "Man found dead in bleeding house, another unexplained tragedy." And the photo beneath it was of him. The town of Guanajuato was a place of beauty and tragedy, its cobbled streets echoing with whispers of the past. Tourists came for its colorful alleys, the Grand Basilica, and the famous Mummy Museum. But few dared to visit La Casa del Lamento, the House of Lamentation. Local legends spoke of an estate on the outskirts of town, built in the early 1800s by Don Esteban Morales, a wealthy but cruel landowner. What was once a mansion of luxury and excess became a place of unspeakable horror. People claimed to hear sorrowful cries drifting through the night, voices of the tormented echoing in the halls. The few who had entered spoke of an unseen presence, something that lurked in the dark corners, watching, waiting. Miguel Rojas was a historian, not a ghost hunter. He had spent years documenting Mexico's forgotten places, revealing truths hidden beneath myth. When he heard about La Casa del Lamento, he knew he had to see it for himself. The house stood just beyond the last row of colonial buildings, past an old cemetery where headstones had crumbled under centuries of neglect. The iron gate was rusted, its hinges barely holding together. The moment Miguel pushed it open, a gust of wind rushed past him, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. The facade of the house was crumbling, ivy climbing up its stone walls. The wooden doors groaned as he stepped inside. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by his presence. The main hall stretched before him, lined with tattered portraits of long-dead ancestors, their eyes hollow, their expressions frozen in time. Miguel set up his camera and voice recorder. Determined to document everything, he had read the stories. The ones that spoke of Don Esteban's crimes. How he had lured desperate peasants into his home with promises of work, only to subject them to cruel tortures in the basement. Some said he had dabbled in black magic, sacrificing souls for his own gain. Others believed the house itself had absorbed the suffering, becoming something sentient, something hungry. He moved carefully through the house, taking notes. The walls bore deep scratches, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. Strange symbols were etched into the stone near the stairwell, their meanings lost to time. The air felt heavy, pressing against his skin. Then came the first sound. A sob, soft, feminine. Miguel turned sharply, shining his flashlight into the darkened hallway. "Hello?" he called, his voice steady. "Is someone here?" Silence. He exhaled, shaking off the nerves. It had to be the wind, or maybe an animal. But then, the sobbing returned, closer this time. He followed the sound, his pulse quickening. The noise led him to a door at the end of the hallway, its frame warped with age. Slowly, he reached for the handle. The door swung open on its own. The room beyond was bathed in moonlight, illuminating a large wooden table covered in dust. But what made Miguel's blood run cold was the woman standing at the far end of the room. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white gown, her long, dark hair cascading over her face. She did not move, did not acknowledge him. She simply stood there, facing the wall, her body trembling with silent sobs. Miguel's instincts screamed at him to run, but his curiosity kept him rooted in place. "Senora?" he called softly. The woman turned. Her face was pale, gaunt, her eyes sunken, but it was her mouth that sent terror through his bones. It was sewn shut with thick, black thread, dried blood crusting the stitches. She raised a trembling hand and pointed to the floor beneath her. Miguel followed her gesture and saw what she meant to show him. The wooden floorboards were rotted through, revealing a dark cavity beneath. Something gleamed in the faint light. Bones. Before he could react, the woman let out a muffled scream, her entire form flickering like a candle in the wind. The door behind him slammed shut, and then everything went black. Miguel awoke to the sensation of cold stone pressing against his cheek. His head pounded as he struggled to recall what had happened. The woman, the bones, the muffled scream. He sat up abruptly, his flashlight rolling across the dusty wooden floor. He was no longer in the room where he had seen the woman. Instead, he was in a chamber beneath the house, a cellar or crypt, its air thick with dampness and decay. His breathing was heavy, his throat dry. How had he gotten here? The only source of light came from his flashlight, now flickering weakly. He scanned the room, his pulse racing. Along the stone walls, ancient chains hung limply, rusted and broken. Wooden crates were stacked in the corners, their contents long since rotted away. And then there were the bones, piles of them, some still wrapped in decayed cloth, others scattered haphazardly across the dirt floor. The woman had shown him this place. But why? A sound echoed through the crypt, a low, guttural whisper. Miguel turned sharply, shining his flashlight toward the noise. The shadows seemed to move, shifting unnaturally. Then he saw them, Figures. Dozens of them. Gaunt and skeletal. Their hollow eyes fixed on him. Their mouths were sewn shut just like the woman's. The black thread pulling at the pale, stretched skin. They did not move at first, only stared, their presence filling the chamber with a suffocating dread. Miguel's breath came in short gasps. He tried to move, but his legs refused to cooperate. He wanted to scream, but his voice was locked in his throat. The figures began to advance. Their movements jerky, unnatural, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. The whispering grew louder, forming words that twisted through Miguel's mind. "You must witness." The woman appeared before him again, her sorrowful eyes pleading. She pointed once more, this time, to the far side of the crypt, where a stone altar stood. Miguel forced himself to his feet, each step toward the altar feeling like wading through thick mud. His flashlight flickered again, barely illuminating the carved symbols on the altar's surface. He brushed away the dust, revealing an inscription in Old Spanish. El que derramó sangre inocente pagará su deuda con las almas. He who has spilled innocent blood shall pay his debt with souls. Miguel's heart clenched. This was it, the root of the curse. Don Esteban had sacrificed those who entered his house, sealing their suffering into the very foundation of La Casa del Lamento. They were bound here, forever reliving their torment. The figures surrounding him let out a unified, muffled wail. The walls trembled, dust cascading from above. The house was waking up, its hunger renewed. Miguel did the only thing he could think of. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small vial of holy water he carried, a habit from his years investigating cursed places. With shaking hands, he uncorked it and splashed the liquid across the altar. A terrible shriek filled the chamber. The ground beneath him trembled violently. The figures recoiled, their bodies flickering like dying embers. The woman, the one who had led him here, met his gaze one last time. And then, she smiled. The darkness collapsed in on itself, swallowing everything. Miguel awoke to the golden light of dawn streaming through a broken window. He was lying in the main hall of La Casa del Lamento, his belongings scattered around him. His head ached, his limbs felt weak, but he was alive. The house was silent. He forced himself to stand, stepping cautiously toward the entrance. The oppressive atmosphere was gone. The weight of centuries-old sorrow lifted. As he reached the threshold, he turned back for one last look. The house remained as it always had, crumbling, ancient, a relic of tragedy. But something was different. The whispering had stopped. The cries were no more. The souls, it seemed, were finally at rest. Miguel exhaled, stepping out into the morning light. His work here was done, but he knew the house would always remember. Château de l'Ombre. The Château de l'Ombre stood atop a lonely hill in the French countryside, its silhouette black against the dying light of the setting sun. The once grand estate had long been abandoned, its halls left to the ghosts of its past. To the villagers below, the chateau was cursed, a place where shadows moved without a source, and whispers echoed through the empty corridors. Few dared to venture near, and those who did never returned the same. The arrival of Julien Moreau. Julien Moreau was not a man to be deterred by superstition. A historian with a passion for uncovering the hidden truths behind old legends. He had spent years researching the dark past of Château de l'Ombre. The estate had been home to the enigmatic Marquis Etienne de Beaumont, a nobleman whose sudden disappearance in 1789 had fueled centuries of speculation. Some said he had been murdered by revolutionaries. Others believed he had struck a deal with forces beyond human comprehension. But the most chilling tale spoke of a portrait, a painting of the Marquis that was said to change its expression, watching those who entered the chateau with knowing eyes. Julien had obtained permission from the local authorities to explore the chateau for a week. He arrived in the village as the last light faded, met only with wary glances from the locals. The innkeeper, an old woman with deep lines of worry etched into her face, tried to dissuade him. "The chateau is not meant for the living," she warned. "If you go, you must not look into the portrait's eyes." Julien dismissed her fears with a polite smile, though a shiver ran through him at her words. He had read of the painting's legend, but surely it was nothing more than an exaggeration. First night in the chateau. The air was thick with dust and decay as Julien stepped inside. His flashlight cast long, flickering shadows along the marble floors, illuminating grand staircases draped in cobwebs and gilded mirrors tarnished with age. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant creaking of wood shifting under centuries of neglect. He set up his equipment in the great hall, placing his notebook and camera on an old oak table. His first priority was finding the infamous portrait. He had seen sketches of it in old records, but nothing compared to witnessing it firsthand. As he explored, he noted the eerie state of preservation, despite the dust. Many rooms remained untouched, as though the chateau had frozen in time. In the library, books lay open as if someone had just been reading them. In the dining room, a table was still set for a meal that had never been eaten. Then he found it, the portrait of the Marquis. It hung in the ballroom, an enormous oil painting in a gilded frame. The Marquis was depicted in his finest attire, his dark eyes piercing, his lips curled in the faintest hint of a smirk. The artistry was impeccable, almost unnervingly lifelike. Julien stepped closer, raising his flashlight to inspect the details. His heart thudded as he noticed something odd. The eyes of the Marquis, deep and shadowed, seemed to follow him as he moved. He took a cautious step to the left. The gaze shifted. A step to the right. The gaze followed. Julien exhaled, shaking his head. It was an old trick of perspective, nothing more. But as he turned to leave, a shudder ran through him. The faintest whisper drifted through the ballroom. "Why have you come?" Julien spun around, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The room was empty. The portrait of the Marquis still hung in place. But now, his smirk was wider, a night of unease. Julien did his best to shake off the unsettling feeling, chalking it up to exhaustion and overactive imagination. He returned to the great hall, where he had set up a small cot for sleeping. The chateau's cold stone walls seemed to absorb all warmth, and the silence was unnatural, as though the very air was listening. As he lay there, he heard it again, the whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Footsteps echoed from the corridor outside the great hall. Slow, deliberate, not the scampering of rodents, nor the settling of an old house, but the sound of boots moving across stone. Julien sat up, His breath caught in his throat. He grabbed his flashlight and moved toward the door, pressing his ear against it. Nothing. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door and peered into the hallway. The corridor was empty, but the candle he had left on a nearby table was flickering violently. Though no breeze passed through the chateau, Julian backed away. Returning to his cot, he told himself it was all in his head, that centuries-old stories had gotten the better of him. But as he lay down, he realized something. The whispering hadn't stopped. It had gotten closer. Julian woke with a start. The whispering had not stopped. It had grown louder, more distinct. It was not just one voice, but many, layered over one another in a chorus of indistinguishable murmurs. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he sat up in his cot, his flashlight still clutched in his trembling hand. The chateau was no longer silent, it was alive with unseen presences. The air had turned icy cold, and his breath came out in small white puffs. His pulse pounded in his ears as he strained to listen. A single word emerged from the murmurs, clear and unmistakable: "Leave." Julian swung the flashlight toward the hallway, but the light flickered violently before dying altogether. Darkness swallowed the room. He fumbled for the backup flashlight in his bag, his fingers shaking as he clicked it on. A shadow moved in the doorway. His stomach clenched. He could feel it watching him, just beyond the reach of the weak beam of light. He wanted to run, but his body refused to move. Then, something else happened. The floor beneath him trembled, and the walls groaned as if the chateau itself had drawn a deep breath. The whispers stopped all at once, replaced by a deafening silence. And then came the footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Julian forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady beneath him. The footsteps grew closer, echoing through the halls with an unnatural weight. He turned toward the corridor just in time to see a flicker of movement, a shadow too tall, too distorted to be human. The sound of something dragging against the floor followed, like fabric scraping against stone. Julian swallowed hard. He had come here to find answers, but he was beginning to regret that decision. He took a step forward, then another. His heart hammered against his ribs as he reached the ballroom once more. The candle he had left on the table had gone out, leaving only the glow of the moon filtering through the massive windows. And then he saw it. The portrait of the Marquis. It had changed. The Marquis' face was no longer the same. The once smug smirk had twisted into a cruel grin, and his eyes, his dark, endless eyes, had widened as if he was watching Julian with amusement. The paint looked fresh, as if it had been altered only moments ago. A sudden gust of wind slammed the doors shut behind him. Julian spun around, heart pounding. But he was alone. The chateau had trapped him inside. Then, from the darkness beyond the portrait, a voice whispered, "You should not have come." Julian turned back, but the painting was no longer just a painting. The Marquis was moving. A skeletal hand emerged from the gilded frame, fingers curling as if reaching for him. The face within the portrait shifted, the Marquis' lips moving silently, forming words that Julian could not understand. The room trembled, the floor beneath him cracked, and tendrils of darkness began to seep from the portrait, stretching toward him like living shadows. Panic surged through his veins. He stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering wildly. Then, a deafening screech. The walls of the ballroom trembled as the windows shattered, glass raining down like jagged ice. The force sent Julian sprawling to the floor, his head striking the cold marble. The room spun around him as darkness threatened to swallow his vision. And then, silence. When Julian opened his eyes, the chateau was still. The portrait was gone. The ballroom was intact, as if nothing had happened. The only evidence of the horrors he had just experienced was the cold sweat clinging to his skin and the lingering sense that someone, was still watching him. He scrambled to his feet and ran. He didn't stop until he had thrown open the grand entrance doors and burst into the night air. The village lights glowed faintly in the distance, promising safety, sanity. He sprinted toward them, refusing to look back. As he reached the outskirts of the village, he finally dared to glance over his shoulder. The Château de l'Ombre stood silent on its lonely hill, its windows dark, but in the moonlight, he saw it, a single figure standing at the highest tower, watching him, and as Julian turned away, he swore he heard a whisper carried by the wind. "See you soon." The Silent Residence. The Silent Residence stood on the outskirts of Melbourne, Australia, shrouded in eerie stillness. Unlike other haunted houses filled with creaking floors and ghostly whispers, this one was different. It did not moan, nor did it howl. It did not cry out in the night or let the wind sing through its cracks. It simply swallowed all sound, an abyss of absolute silence. Dr. Evelyn Carter was no stranger to the unexplainable. As a professor of paranormal studies, she had spent over a decade documenting cases of supernatural phenomena. Yet, nothing had unnerved her quite like the Silent Residence. Reports of the house had been sporadic over the years, always the same. People who spent more than a night inside claimed that the silence deepened, pressing against them, swallowing their voices until they could no longer speak. Some never regained their ability to speak. Determined to uncover the truth, Evelyn arranged to stay for a week. The house, once a grand estate built in the late 19th century, had long been abandoned. Its last known owner, Arthur Langley, had vanished without a trace in 1928. Since then, tenants came and went, all leaving within days. None could bear the overwhelming hush that suffocated the space. On the evening of her arrival, Evelyn stepped through the front door, feeling the difference immediately. The air was thick, heavy with something unseen. She spoke aloud, her own voice unnaturally muted. Her assistant, Mark Dawson, who had accompanied her for the research, tested a theory by clapping his hands together. Nothing. No echo. No vibration. No sound at all. Evelyn pulled out her recording equipment, setting up in the grand foyer. The house was magnificent despite its decay. Chandeliers hung in eerie stillness. The wallpaper faded but untouched by time. A grand piano sat in the drawing room, its keys yellowed with age. The first night was uneventful. They documented the unnatural silence, noting how even their own footsteps failed to make a sound. Evelyn tried speaking into her recorder, but when she played it back, the tape was blank. Then, just past midnight, things changed. Mark tapped Evelyn's shoulder, his face pale. He pointed toward the staircase, where a figure stood, a woman in a Victorian dress, her eyes hollow, her mouth open wide as if screaming. But no sound came. The figure flickered, her form disjointed, as if reality itself struggled to keep her contained. Evelyn reached for her camera, but as soon as she lifted it, The woman vanished. They didn't sleep that night. By the second day, the silence became oppressive. It was no longer the absence of noise but an active force. As if something in the house wanted to consume all sound. Evelyn and Mark communicated through writing. Their voices stolen the moment they opened their mouths. As they explored, they found remnants of Arthur Langley's life, a dusty study filled with journals, sketches of strange symbols on the walls, and notes referencing something called the hollowing. In one entry, dated 2 days before his disappearance, Langley had written, "The silence is spreading. It is no longer confined to the house. I feel it inside me. The more I listen, the less of me remains. I must find a way to stop it before I am nothing." The words sent a chill through Evelyn's bones. Could the silence be something sentient? Something that fed on sound? On voices? That night, as they sat in the study reviewing Langley's notes, Evelyn noticed something unsettling. The ink on the old papers had started to fade. The longer they stayed, the more the words were erased, as if the house was devouring them too. Then came the knocking. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable, but with each second, it grew louder. The strange thing was that they didn't hear it with their ears. They felt it, a vibration against their bones, their skulls reverberating with a force that had no sound. Mark clutched his head, his expression twisted in pain. Evelyn grabbed him by the arm, dragging him toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. The lights flickered, the air became suffocating. The silence was no longer empty, it was alive, pulsating, creeping into their bodies. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the knocking stopped, and the whispers started, not in their ears, but in their heads. A single phrase repeated over and over. "It's too late." Evelyn turned to Mark, but his eyes were wide with terror. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. They were losing their voices, their existence, and the silent residence was consuming them. Evelyn tried to scream, but the silence swallowed her voice before it could escape her lips. The world around her was shifting, warping under the weight of something unseen. The silent residence was no longer just a house, it was a presence. Vast and all-consuming, and it was pulling them deeper into its void. Mark clutched at his throat, his face twisted in horror. His lips moved frantically, but not a single sound came forth. His breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling as if he were suffocating in the absence of noise. Evelyn grabbed his arm, trying to pull him toward the door. But something was wrong. The walls were stretching. The hallway that had been only a few feet away now seemed impossibly distant, elongating before their eyes. The grand chandelier above flickered, its light dimming into an unnatural darkness that spread like ink across the ceiling. Then came the whispers, not from the walls, not from the air, from within them. Evelyn clutched her head as the words slithered into her thoughts, invading every corner of her mind. The voices were layered, a cacophony of stolen sound twisting into meaning. "You are fading. You do not belong. Leave before you are nothing." Mark stumbled, his eyes unfocused, his grip on reality slipping. His hands trembled as he reached into his jacket, pulling out a small notebook. With shaking fingers, he scrawled something onto a page and turned it to Evelyn. "I can't hear my own thoughts." Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears. She took the pen from Mark's hand and wrote frantically, "We have to get out. Now." Mark nodded, but his movements were slow, sluggish, like something was draining him. The shadows thickened around them, curling against the walls like living things. They moved toward the door. But with each step, the silence deepened, pressing against them like a suffocating weight. Evelyn's mind raced. The journals in the study. Arthur Langley's final words, the hollowing. The silence was not merely an absence of sound. It was a force, an entity, and it was feeding on them. She remembered Langley's warning, the more you listen, the less of you remains. She had to stop listening. Closing her eyes, she forced her mind away from the silence, away from the terrible nothingness that surrounded them. She focused on her breathing, on the feeling of the wooden floor beneath her feet. She tugged on Mark's arm, urging him to do the same. The pressure lessened. The hallway shrank, pulling itself back into its proper dimensions. The darkness hesitated, as if confused. Evelyn's eyes snapped open. She grabbed Mark's wrist and ran. The walls trembled as they bolted down the corridor, past the study, past the grand piano that sat untouched in the drawing room. The silence fought back, clawing at them, but they no longer acknowledged it. They ran as if their lives depended on it, because they did. The front door loomed ahead. Just a few more steps. A figure stood in their path. Arthur Langley, or what remained of him. His form was translucent, a husk of a man long consumed by the house's insatiable hunger. His mouth moved, but no sound came. His hands reached out, desperate, pleading. Mark faltered, but Evelyn yanked him forward. "Don't stop. Don't listen." Langley's expression twisted in agony as they passed through him, his body disintegrating into dust. The house let out one final, furious tremor as Evelyn shoved the door open. And they were free. The moment they stepped outside, a rush of noise struck them like a tidal wave. The wind rustling through the trees, the distant chirping of birds, their own ragged breathing. Mark let out a shuddering gasp. Collapsing onto the ground, he could hear again. They both could. Evelyn turned back, her chest heaving. The silent residence stood as it always had, a relic of forgotten nightmares. But something was different. The windows were dark. The house was empty. The silence was gone. They never spoke of what happened inside. They didn't need to. A week later, Evelyn received a package with no return address. Inside was a single, yellowed page ripped from Arthur Langley's journal. The silence can be starved, but never destroyed. It waits for those who listen. And beneath it, scrawled in fresh ink, "You heard it once. You will hear it again."